Howdy, and welcome back to Wild West Deep Dives. This week, we're going to be talking about the legend of Ed Rose. He was a true pioneer of the American West. He was part of the first expeditions in the fur trade, and he was a man that did not know the meaning of fear. No, 5 scalps stared death in the eyes and gave a sharp smirk at it through his scarred face, earning the respect from the Crow Nation and becoming a chief. But who was he? Where'd he come from? How'd he earn the nickname 5 Scalps? And was he really the man that warned the fur trappers about their Rickera sneak attack? Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name's Steven, and this is Wild West Deep Dives. The early life of Edward Rose is full of mystery, with much of his background and origins remaining uncertain even to this day. Though he was likely born around 1780 in Louisville, Kentucky. The names of his parents are also lost, but his father was possibly a French-Canadian trapper, trader, and explorer, and his mother was possibly part black and part Cherokee. But this unique ancestry, blending the bloodlines of 3 different continents, helped forge the strong, imposing physical presence that would become Rose's trademark. Again, there is nothing verified, there are just historians going by hearsay and assumptions. But here's what we know, and bear with me, it moves quickly. At the age of 18, he made his way down to New Orleans as a deckhand of a keelboat. If you're wondering what a keelboat is, please go listen to our latest deep dive on Hugh Glass. I give a full description in episode 2 of that series. Regardless, it is believed that this is when he got the famous scar on his face while in New Orleans. Though historians disagree whether it happened during a fight at a bar or as a result of an accident. Nevertheless, his nose was cut, and he also got a harsh scar on his forehead. Rose was said to be muscular, thick-set, and tall. He had dark, sharp eyes that didn't miss anything, and he was a serious man. Rose is first mentioned in history in St. Louis at the same time as a significant occasion. The Lewis and Clark expedition came back home in 1806, after 2 years of exploring the new United States acquisition, the Louisiana Purchase. Over the next 2 decades, Ed Rose would play an important and leading role of the expeditions out west. He was one of the earliest of these mountain men. As Felton H.W. says in his book, who is the main source for this episode, in which I got the majority of the information from his book, which the title I will not say precisely, but paraphrasing it, his book, Black Trailblazer, says that he was, quote, the Trailblazer's Trailblazer. In these unknown western spaces, danger was around every corner. Indians were sometimes friend, sometimes enemy. You won't know until the gunfire starts. But in the spring of 1806, Ed Rose was in St. Louis. He spent that year on the Osage River, about 150 miles southwest of St. Louis. In the spring of 1807, he bargained with the trader Manuel Lisa to ascend the Missouri River with him to the mouth of the Yellowstone. Here's a bit about Manuel Lisa. Just like Ed Rose, little is known about his early life. He was born in New Orleans on the 8th of September, 1772, of Spanish parents. He went to St. Louis at around 18 years old in 1800 and was involved in the fur trade with the Osage Indians. He was a man of high intelligence and had incredible bravery. These 2 traits were necessary for one of the most dangerous industries known to mankind. As Sidney Greenby stated in the book, Fur to Furrows, Lisa had, quote, bones that were flint, and who struck them struck fire and burned his fingers. Very few men could handle the dangers and rigors of the fur trade. Between the currents of the river, the dozen native tribes hunting for a scalp, and the hostile land that was waiting for him. But Edward Rose was exactly the type of man that Manuel Lisa was looking for. 42 men were in the group that went to Yellowstone with Manuel Lisa in the spring of 1807. Among these men were John Potts and Pete Weiser, who had just returned from their trip to the Pacific with Lewis and Clark the year before. These men were to be the first to attempt the fur trade on a large scale, in the region around the headwaters of the Missouri. As Hiram Martin Chinnington said in his book, A History of the American Fur Trade in the Far West, quote, it was a venture of no little hazard, for the destination was more than 2,000 miles away, among tribes whose friendship was at least doubtful. and a goodly portion on the route lay through the country of other tribes already well known for their treacherous and desperate character. The keelboats they were pushing and dragging up the river were tough to manage with the erratic and shifting river currents. They often ran close to the shore, within reach of an arrow or ball from a hostile native. When they reached the Arikaras in present-day South Dakota, they were met by 200 to 300 warriors who fired a volley across their bow. It was damn near impossible to ignore their command, and they put the boat ashore. Women appeared with bags of corn to trade. When an Indian rushed up and cut the bags of corn open, there was a bit of a scuffle. Was this a signal for an attack? Lisa called his men to arms and trained his 2 small swivel cannons upon the shore. Ed Rose and the other men took aim. The Arikaras knew the meaning of the guns, and they understood the determined look of the men behind the rifle. But the expected attack never came. With the prompt action, courage, and readiness for battle, the firefight was prevented. 100 miles farther north, the party passed the Mandan villages without serious incident. The daily battle between the trappers and the river continued to give them constant excitement and frustration. But as the fur trade saying goes, the biggest danger is always around the next bend. This came true with the sight of a band of Assiniboines, 4,000 to 5,000 of them. This was no accident. All the way upstream, the news of the trappers had always gone ahead of them. News traveled from one tribe to the next, and quickly. 42 men on a heavy, difficult-to-maneuver keelboat would be no match for thousands of hostile natives. The trappers loaded their muskets and cannon, steered the boat directly toward the Assiniboines, and fired. They purposely aimed well over the heads of them, but it served its purpose. The Assiniboines dashed into the hills and fled. A few braves and chiefs returned to smoke the peace pipe and receive gifts, a sign of peace from the trappers, and the threat was now gone. The giving of presents was incredibly important in the handling of native tribes. At every social or business meeting, friendship and non-hostility was expressed in the exchanging of gifts. Obviously, at times, this didn't always work out, but it was our only opportunity to show that they were friendlies. The knowledge of when to give gifts, what to give, but also when not to give gifts was necessary for a fur trapper, and this talent was possessed by Ed Rose. Most of what we know of Edward Rose comes from Lieutenant Reuben Holmes. As a graduate of the prestigious United States Military Academy, Holmes brought a keen eye for detail and a disciplined, analytical approach to his operations of the rugged mountain men he encountered during the Atkinson O'Fallon expedition. And of the 500 hardy souls that made up that storied party, it was the figure of Ed Rose that seemed to captivate Holmes' imagination the most. Some of the information of Rose comes from his own lips, but much of it comes from, as Felton H.W. puts it, quote, prairie shop talk, mountain man yarns, and folklore. Tales of heroism were often preserved by stories told around campfires, just as much of early Western history comes to us as. One such event was the infamous clash between Rose and the powerful fur trader Manuel Lisa in the spring of 1808. Lisa always thought that Rose gave away too many gifts to the native tribes, and as a result, there were less goods to trade for furs. When Rose returned to the fort with less furs than Lisa wanted, there was a quarrel. As Holmes tells it, it's a longer quote, but here we go. Quote, this quarrel took place between them in the counting room of the establishment, and almost at the moment of Mr. Lisa's departure. The boat, in fact, was waiting for him with the crew on their benches. They were alone, and during the dispute, Rose sprang like a tiger upon his disputant, and overpowering him before he had noticed such an intention, would probably have killed him, had not the noise of the scuffle brought a man by the name of Potts to the relief of Mr. Lisa. After the initial fight, Lisa went to the waiting boat. But Rose was not quite finished with him. He ran to the swivel cannon and pointed it toward the departing boat, and set it off. The result was near tragedy, mixed with a touch of frontier humor. Holmes states, quote, just as a man was passing in front of its muzzle, he happened to be a long-legged man, and in the fact of stepping, so that the canister of bullets passed harmlessly between his legs, and only caused him to jump a few feet in the air, and fall directly in front of the piece enveloped in smoke, from which place he roared out that he was dead. No one was seriously injured, and the incident was soon forgotten about. Manuel Lisa returned to St. Louis in the spring of 1808, with a keelboat full of furs. He continued the trade with a larger company the following year, but Ed Rose chose to stay with the Crows. This is when he earned his name, Five Scalps. A small band of 11 Minnitari or Hidatsa warriors and a young boy, tasked with carrying their moccasins, had made camp in a wooded area atop a ridge overlooking a narrow valley below. Carefully concealed and watchful, the war party scanned the distant horizon, their keen eyes eventually spotting a lone Crow warrior and his squaw. Recognizing an opportunity to claim coveted scalps, the Minnitari silently readied their bows, tensing with anticipation as the unsuspecting Crow couple drew near. Suddenly, the eerie twain of bowstrings rent the air, and a volley of arrows rained down upon the startled pair. The Crow warrior's pained cries echoed through the valley as he was struck, staggering and succumbing to the deadly accuracy of the Minnitari attack. However, the warrior's squaw managed to evade the onslaught, spurring her horse onward as the Minnitaris whooped their fierce war cries. Though the Minnitaris gave chase, the woman's impressive horsemanship and the superior speed of her Crow pony allowed her to outpace them and make her escape. Gathering their meager belongings, the wary Minnitari war party hastily departed, knowing the Crows would soon retaliate for their loss of their kinsman. Upon receiving the woman's desperate report, the enraged Crow braves and Ed Rose rapidly mobilized, their thirst for vengeance notable as they tracked the Minnitaris. Lieutenant Holmes states, quote, "Rose like a bloodhound let loose from his chain, took the trail, followed by what would have been considered, by an inexperienced beholder, a group of demons." The chase went on for hours, but Ed Rose and the Crows, with their superior horsemanship and fresh horses, gradually got closer and closer to the Minnitaris, whose mounts were tired and worn from several days on the warpath. Soon, the Crows were on top of them. The Minnitaris headed for an area that was heavily timbered, a rocky shelf that jutted above the ground. The first arrived and climbed to the top and found themselves in a natural fort. They were well protected by rocks, trees, and high ground. Lieutenant Holmes states, quote, "They were at the wood. Some had entered it and leaped from their horses, and just as the last one was within feet of it, Rose came within reach of his horse's tail. He seized it with his right hand and gave his own horse a sudden turn to the left. Both horses and both men came to the ground in an instant, and before either could recover the use of his legs or weapons, a Crow had buried his club into the skull of the Minnitari. But the rest of the Minnitaris were now well protected. The Crows now realized how difficult an attack on this place would be, and it made them no longer eager to battle. But Rose was not so easily discouraged. Turning to his hesitant companions, yelling, quote, "You are dogs that dare not bite until the wolf no longer shows his teeth. You would run from a dead badger. Follow me, and if you are afraid, let me hold your shields before you." Few men on the frontier would have dared to taunt the fierce Crow warriors in such a brazen manner, for the Crow were renowned for their fierce warrior spirit and uncompromising code of honor. Yet the bold and reckless Ed Rose had somehow managed to provoke and incite these fearsome braves, and they now appeared poised to follow him into the fray. As the Crow warrior band charged forward, their war cries echoing across the rugged landscape, Rose raced ahead, drawing them onward. But when the first volley of arrows from the Minnitari defenders rained down, striking and felling 5 of the Crow, the warriors abruptly halted in their tracks, hesitating at the unexpected resistance. Undaunted, Rose alone continued his charge, standing defiantly atop the Minnitari breastworks as the enemy arrows fell all around him. Pausing for a moment, he turned and strode calmly back towards his own people, the ultimate insult spilling from his lips. He had branded the Crow as squaws, a fighting word that cut to the core of their fierce warrior pride. Enraged, Rose then seized 2 shields, lashing them together, and with only a knife and a battle axe in hand, he rushed headlong back towards the Minnitari defenses, certain that his Crow brethren would have no choice but to follow lest they be shamed. As he leapt over the rocky breastworks, 2 musket balls and 3 arrows struck his makeshift shield, the force of the blows knocking him to the ground. Lieutenant Holmes states, quote, "His time, however, had not yet come, and before the Minnitaris could turn around, he was in their den. He was a wolf in a sheepfold. Such was their astonishment that they could only stand and gaze. The Crows followed him this time. Ed Rose was alone and winning coups. honors that would be sung and told around campfires for years. He quickly killed 3 braves and badly wounded 2 more. His braves now rushed to share the glory. The only Minnitari to escape was the moccasin carrier. The tale of how Edward Rose earned the reverend name of Chiho Carte, or 5 Scalps, had become the stuff of legends among the Crow tribe. Rose's incredible acts of bravery during a fierce battle had earned him the utmost honor and respect from his fellow warriors. When he returned to the Crow village after a long absence, the entire community erupted in celebration at his arrival. As Lieutenant Holmes witnessed, every member of the tribe, from the eldest chiefs to the youngest children, recognized Rose's heroic exploits and the pride he had brought to their people. The older warriors greeted him with the exclamations of surprise and quickly invited him to join in the celebratory feast, while the younger men, who had known him since their youth, crowded around, eager to hear of his adventures and learn if he had come back to stay with them permanently. Rose had a kind word and everyone a smile for him, demonstrating the deep bond he shared with his tribal family. The sheer joy and universal delight expressed by the Crows at Rose's return made it clear that the legacy of the great 5 Scalps would be passed through generations, ensuring his legendary status would live on as long as the tribe endured. In the spring of 1809, Ed Rose found himself with Ezekiel Williams and 20 other men on the first all-land trip to the mountains. In the group, there was a Mandan head chief named Big White, or Shahiki, his wife and child, who traveled to Washington with Lewis and Clark and were now attempting to make it home. Upon his first attempt to return back to his village, they were attacked by Arikara and Sioux warriors and were forced back to St. Louis. In 1809, the Missouri Fur Company was paid $7,000, about $179,000 today, for the safe return of the Mandan chief. Manuel Lisa, Andrew Henry, William Clark, and the other men who were all experienced in the western fur trade were involved. The expedition left St. Charles on the 15th of June with each man allotted a 2-year supply of lead, powder, and 6 beaver traps. The traps weighed 5 pounds each, and they were given an extra horse whose pack contained pistols, awls, aces, knives, camp kettles, blankets, and other essential little articles, as well as little notions for presents for the natives. Leaving the familiar confines of their previous location, the party ventured northward, strategically maintaining a distance of more than 100 miles from the mighty Missouri River. This calculated move allowed them to avoid the grueling task of constantly climbing up and down the steep bluffs that lined the river's banks. Instead, they traversed the vast prairies cut by ravines, gullies, creeks, and rivers, each bearing their own set of unique challenges. As they pushed deeper into this untamed wilderness, the party encountered a succession of unfamiliar Indian tribes, each with their own customs and warrior traditions. Some of these tribes were known to be highly aggressive, their braves eager to claim the scalps of any unwary travelers who crossed their path. Indeed, in this lawless frontier, where the only rule was the roll of the gun, the party had to remain ever vigilant, ready to defend themselves at a moment's notice against any potential threats that may arise. They kept a sharp lookout in the daytime with riders on each flank to prevent a surprise attack. They stopped an hour before sundown, built a big fire, cooked and ate, let their horses feed, then after sunset, they would quickly pack and move 8 to 10 miles away and sleep in a fireless camp. In this way, they avoided surprise attacks on their campsites. As the small party came upon Indian villages, Ed Rose served well as an interpreter. Though he may not have spoken the language of the tribe, he was fluent in the universal sign language of the plains. On the 1st of July, after 3 months of hard and dangerous travel, the party reached the Mandan villages. Big White was delivered to his tribe safe and sound. It took a few days to rest and replenish, and then moved on toward the headwaters of the Missouri to search for good beaver streams. But these streams were near Blackfoot country. Washington Irving wrote that it was, quote, country over which roves and prowls the ferocious Blackfeet Indians, then as well as now, one of the most cruel and relentless tribes of the far west. For the Blackfeet Indian is an embodiment of every quality that is offensive to the feelings of a civilized man. When they arrived at the Yellowstone, they turned southwest and followed the river toward the Bighorn. Here, they trapped and rested themselves and their horses. They needed time to recover from their hard and long trip over the Badlands. Felton H.W. writes, quote, "They needed time for sore backs and sore feet to mend. Time for lush prairie grasses to put a layer of fat on gaunt loins and over the ridges of sharp ribs stretching against galled, sweat-stained hide." Fish and game were plentiful, but it was not peaceful. 10 men hunting buffalo were attacked by Blackfeet, with only 5 escaping. They expected another attack, with the only question being, when? But the attack never came, and they were soon among the Crows. 5 Scalps, an old friend and a chief among the Crow, was a good man to be with. The Crows received them as friends, and they remained there for a week. The Crows then pointed out the route in which the men should take. The party were to move south toward the sources of the Platte River, but they would be going without one important piece to their puzzle. Ed Rose expressed his intention to abandon the party. 5 Scalps was home again, in the land of the Crows. The mystery surrounding Ed Rose's whereabouts over the next 2 years, leading up to the summer of 1811, has long intrigued historians. While the details remain murky, it is generally believed that Rose spent this time living amongst the Crow tribe, though there is no official documentation to confirm this. Then, on a fateful June day in 1811, the largest fur trading party the industry would see for over a decade came to a sudden halt before the Arikara villages along the Missouri River. To the surprise of the assembled trappers and merchants, a muscular, dark-clad figure on horseback emerged from the prairie hills and crossed the river to join them. This was none other than Ed Rose, though it remains unclear exactly how he learned of their presence. Nonetheless, Rose was swiftly engaged as a guide and interpreter for the expedition, which was being led by a man named Wilson Hunt, a partner of John Jacob Astor, America's first millionaire and a titan of the fur trade. By 1800, Astor had already established himself as a leading fur merchant, but his ambitions were far from satisfied. In 1808, he founded the American Fur Company, with a grand plan of gathering furs from the far western reaches of the continent. Astor invested a staggering $400,000, the equivalent of around $10 million today, to fund his endeavor, hiring a team of associates and employees to carry it out. The strategy involved sending a ship to sail around South America and up the Pacific coast to the mouth of the Columbia River, while a separate overland party would retrace the route of the Lewis and Clark expedition. The two groups were intended to meet and establish a post at Astoria, from which they could tap into the rich fur resources of the surrounding region. The ship, named the Tonquin, set sail from Sandy Hook on September 8, 1810, beginning its long journey to the Pacific Northwest. The overland party were called the Astorians and led by Wilson Price Hunt. He was a leading merchant from New Jersey who had been involved in the fur trade in St. Louis since 1804. But he was no hunter or trapper. He was not well equipped to head such an expedition. There were other partners who were along for the journey as well. These men included Donald Mackenzie, Joshua Miller, Robert McClellan, and Ramsey Cooks, each of which had more experience in the wilderness. A man by the name of Pierre Dorian was engaged as an interpreter. He was the son of the interpreter from the Lewis and Clark expedition. And in April of 1811, the party broke camp and traveled against the floodwaters of the Missouri in 4 boats that carried 3 small cannon. The 5 partners were accompanied by the interpreter and his family, a clerk, 40 Canadian voyageurs, and several hunters and trappers. Hunt planned to go up the river, but he learned that the dangers of the Mandans, Blackfeet, and Sioux Indians were too great to proceed. He considered leaving the river and taking the unknown march overland to the mountain passes. The party had 3 guides, none of which had been west of the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains. With the ever-present thought of the savage Arikaras, the thought of still even more savage tribes to come, all the stories of hardship of land travel, of hunger and thirst, caused the 40 Canadians to start the talk of desertion. They made their attempt to steal boats and arms and return to St. Louis, but they were halted. At a crucial juncture in their expedition, the historians were delighted to be joined by the experienced frontiersman Ed Rose. Even his old friend, sometime enemy Manuel Lisa, can be thought to have been delighted to see him as well, knowing the importance of what he could provide to their party. The Astorians, a well-financed group, carried a treasure trove of manufactured goods, but they knew they needed all the help they can get to navigate the challenging terrain and interactions with native tribes they would encounter. In the eyes of these indigenous groups, the Astorians' wares held far greater worth than gold, making their journey fraught with both opportunity and peril. Fortunately, Ed Rose was uniquely qualified for the task at hand. His deep knowledge of the land routes through the Upsaroka territory of the Crow Nation, as well as the treacherous Rockies, made him an invaluable asset. Rose also held a position of respect with Crow councils, granting the Astorians a degree of leverage and goodwill they may not have otherwise enjoyed. With a man of Rose's caliber at their side, Wilson Hunt and his party could now consider leaving the relative safety of the river and striking out overland, avoiding the most savage native tribes, and, should they be unable to do so, having an ideal guide and protector in Rose. On the 18th of July, 1811, the party set off west. The expedition would soon split with Manuel Issa, who decided to remain behind to travel on the tributaries of the Missouri. Washington Irving, in his book Astoria, A History of the Activities of the American Fur Company, states, quote, "The veteran trappers and voyagers of Lisa's party shook their heads as their comrades set out, and took leave of them as of doomed men, and even Lisa himself gave it as his opinion, after the travelers had departed, that they would never reach the shores of the Pacific, but would either perish with hunger in the wilderness or be cut off by savages." The opinions of these men held no weight to one man who turned his face toward the setting sun and set off with confidence. Ed Rose had gone to the western mountains at least twice already. He knew the land and what to expect, so they set off. There were 64 people, including Dorian's wife, his 2 children, and 84 horses. 76 of the horses were used as pack animals, loaded down with the baggage, bedding, trade goods, traps and ammunition, cornmeal, and other necessities. The 5 partners rode. Dorian's baggage and children were on another. The rest of the party walked. The guides and hunters kept their eyes sharp, moved ahead and on the flanks with their guns in hand. With the guides, and usually at the end of the long train, was Ed Rose, the man whom the safety of the journey to the land of the Crows depended on. After 5 days of hard travel, they stopped on the banks of the Grand River, near the camp of a band of Cheyenne Indians. The 2 parties spent a pleasant couple weeks exchanging gifts and visits. The Cheyennes were, as Felton H.W. puts it, quote, well-behaved people, clean, vigorous, and well-dressed in garments beautifully made of hides and furs. The Cheyennes were excellent horsemen, and Hunt bought 36 horses from them. A fresh horse was given to Ed Rose, and the rest were distributed among the voyagers who could now ride. They were now far enough from the Missouri that Hunt began to feel easier about his men deserting. It was unlikely that the men would desert into this country, as there was more safety in numbers. But Wilson Price had unlocked a new fear, an unreasoned fear that he could not shake, a fear of Ed Rose. Someone in the party told Hunt that Rose was secretly planning a revolt from his men when they reached the land of the Crows and make away with their goods and horses. Instead of confronting the issue head on, he shared the secret with his other partners who also kept it a secret. Therefore, they lived in fear and watchfulness. Rose's fierce scar on his face, his cut nose, and the nickname of 5 Scalps did not ease Hunt's feeling. Constance L. Skinner in Adventures of Oregon states that, quote, Hunt's ignorance of wilderness life came near to wrecking the overland expedition. She then points out that Hunt failed to enlist the crew he needed. If Hunt had only known it, he had in Rose exactly the man who could guide him safely to his destination. But Hunt's fears led him to offer a promise of reward to Rose upon passing safely through Crow territory. He offered half a year's wages, 3 beaver traps, and a horse. The party faced a grueling journey as they traveled through the rugged wilderness, navigating treacherous terrain that alternatingly challenged and rewarded them. They traversed windy rivers and streams, scaling steep rocky ridges and plunging into deep valleys, all while dwarfed by the savage cliffs looming overhead. At times, the path led them through wild, jungle-like thickets of rock, but when the hills eventually gave way, the open prairie offered a welcome respite, with buffalo herds providing ample sustenance. However, this easier travel was short-lived, as the relentless summer heat had dried up the small creeks, forcing the party to endure a punishing 25-mile stretch without a single drop of water. Just when they thought they had found reprieve in the small body of water, they faced yet another 18-mile bone-dry expanse as they pressed towards the distant Bighorn Range. They crossed the Little Missouri, the Little Powder, and the Powder River until at last they reached the wide, grassy meadows teeming with buffalo. Here, they were able to jerk the abundant meat, securing provisions for several more days of travel. But their journey was not without perils, and on the 22nd of August, the party came across the telltale tracks of a large group of Indians. They were distinctively kidney-shaped prints with deep insteps. The group grew silent. As Edward Rose analyzed the prints, he gave a slight grin as he recognized them. They were crow prints. The kidney-shaped tracks with deep insteps distinguished them as crow prints from the more triangular or oval print of Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Blackfeet, or Pawnee. And by the 30th of August, they had traveled 400 miles in 42 days and were finally in the land of the Crows. But they were not safe yet. They had not reached the villages. Hunters and raiding parties from neighboring tribes could be anywhere. Suddenly, two mounted figures appeared in the distance. Washington Irving described this moment, stating, quote, "In the edge of the evening, not long after they had encamped at the foot of the Bighorn Sierra, a couple of wild-looking beings, scantily clad in skins but well-armed, and mounted on horses as wild-looking as themselves, were seen approaching with great caution from among the rocks. They might have been mistaken for two of the evil spirits of the mountains, so formidable in Indian fable." If Hunt knew of such beliefs as savage evil spirits, his heart must have skipped a beat. But no matter how excited or afraid he was, he needed Ed Rose, and he called him for help. It was a tense few moments of obvious danger. Rose mounted and rode toward the evil spirits. It was now or never for Hunt. They were in the land of the Crows, who had thousands of warriors. If Ed Rose chose to betray the expedition, as Hunt had feared, it would have been a slaughter. Belton H.W. states, quote, "If he chose, the historians would disappear before the Crows like a gopher in the paws of a grizzly bear." The next day, a large band of Crow warriors swept toward the camp, thundering hoofbeats, yelling and whooping, making Hunt's spine chill. But Rose did not choose betrayal. It was a show of pleasure at the return of their chief, Chihokarte, 5 Scalps. After the welcome, the two parties rode 16 miles to the Crow village where the Easterners were received as guests and made welcome. Wilson Hunt gave the Crows presents and in turn the Indians gave gifts to their guests. The following day was passed in trading and resting. Exhausted mounts were traded for new ones. Precious blankets, powder, balls, knives, tobacco, and other gifts were traded for skins and furs. After the trading was complete, the Hunt party had 121 active, sound, and well-suited mountain horses. Ed Rose was a genial host. He walked through the camp making sure that things went smoothly, and that no trouble occurred. It was at this time that Hunt probably learned that the promise of a half-year's wage, 3 beaver traps, and a horse was meaningless to a man like Rose. He owned hundreds of horses, plenty of Indian-made beaver traps, and money meant nothing. Ed Rose had performed his duty to lead Hunt's party safely to Upsaroka. He was content to remain with the Crows. Goodbyes were said, and Hunt continued on, with no doubt a sigh of relief. Hunt followed along the side of the mountain range, looking for a way to turn the party west and cross over the mountains. After traveling 15 miles, they had found no pass. They tried again and again to force passage over the mountains, but failed time after time. Hunt finally withdrew 6 miles to a stream, and built a signal fire to guide the lost men back to camp. Hunt was furious. None of the guides, partners, or men could find a way across the mountains. They were now exhausted and needed rest. The following morning, Ed Rose appeared with the band of Crows. Hunt still feared Rose, but Rose showed no sign of treachery. He invited the historians to follow him, and whatever Hunt's personal opinions he had of Rose, he had no choice but to accept the offer. The mountain trail was rough and broken, but the party followed Rose as his horse moved between the rocks and ledges. It seemed as if there was no way through. Then suddenly, it was over. The path to the ocean was clear. Rose and the crows drew aside, and the historians streamed past. As Ed sat on his mount, he was a perfect picture of strength, skill, and confidence. A great movement to the fur country was well underway. William H. Ashley and Andrew Henry were partners in what would eventually become the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, and they began to organize large expeditions of trappers for the Rocky Mountain fur trade. Ashley had left St. Louis on the 15th of April, 1823, with 100 enterprising young men. This was a famous Ashley 100s expedition that included famous characters such as Jedediah Smith, Jim Bridger, William Sublett, and many, many more. Included in this group of men was our latest deep dive series on the legendary mountain man, Hugh Glass. If you want to hear this story more in depth, please go listen to episode 2 of the Hugh Glass series. I will be brief in this episode as I do a deep dive in the Glass series, but here we go. As Ashley traveled up the Missouri, after having to go back to St. Louis after one of the keel boats capsized and they lost all their necessary gear, food, etc., they reached their Arikara villages on the 31st of May. Here's where it starts to get a bit confusing with the information we do and don't have. We are now in 1823, and he said goodbye to the Wilson Price Hunt expedition in 1811. So over the last decade or so, information on what Rose was doing has been lost to history. But it is generally believed that he lived with the crows for the time. It is also believed that he spent 3 years with the Arikara after learning their language. And lastly, there is word that Rose went back to St. Louis after fathering children in an Omaha village, a branch of the umbrella of the Crow tribe, where he became an alcoholic and got arrested, and was sent to St. Louis, and this is when he responded to the 100 enterprising young men ad and could have possibly been part of the original trip. So where does the truth really lie? Who knows? Historians will debate it until they're blue in the face. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle of these stories, but regardless, he was there when Ashley's men arrived at their Arikara's village. If you remember from the Hugh Glass episode, William Ashley had gone to the Arikara village at the invitation from the chief, and took just one other man with him. It is believed that this man was Ed Rose. Ashley was surprised by the expressions of friendship, but Rose was not so easily deceived, and he warned Ashley. But Ashley chose not to listen to Rose, and decided to trade and buy the horses that he desperately needed. But according to Hiram M. Chiddington, he tells us, quote, Ashley seems to have been about as suspicious of Rose as Hunt had been 12 years before, and with just as little reason. He rejected Rose's advice to moor the boats for the night against a bar on the opposite side of the river, and not only remained near the shore next to the villages, but even left his land party. The party numbered about 40 men, and had with them all the horses which they had just purchased. After a day of trade, Ed Rose and a man named Aaron Stevens stayed back in the village, where Stevens possibly snuck back into the camp for their Arikara women. But after giving orders for a sunrise start by land and water, Ashley had gone to sleep thinking the Arikara were no threat. When he was awakened at approximately 3 a.m. on the morning of the 2nd of June, Rose informed him that Aaron Stevens had been killed by the Arikara, and that the way the Indians were acting, he judged that they planned a sneak attack. At sunup, the battle began. The gunfire was intense. Rose stood on the beach and returned fire. Legend goes that the Arikara warriors told Rose to leave the trappers and save himself, but to this, he declined. Some men on the beach felt that the situation was helpless and retreated into the river and swam for the boats. But most of the men on the beach stood their ground and were determined not to retreat, but roughly half the men on the beach were either killed or wounded. This forced the majority of them to retreat, but Ed Rose and Hugh Glass covered the retreat. Glass then plunged into the river and swam to the boat under a shower of bullets and arrows. Ed Rose covered Glass's retreat, but one rifle could not hold off advancing Arikara warriors. Just before the Arikara warriors took over the beach, Ed Rose dove into the river and escaped to the boat. Lieutenant Reuben Holmes in the 5 Scalps described Rose's activity in the battle, and says that he had, quote, at the very commencement, taken his station behind a small branch of willows, from which detached and alone, he fired as often as an Indian showed himself. He apparently thought of nothing but the work in which he was engaged. all ideas of boats and safety had fled before the excitement of a scene so congenial to his feeling. Nor was it until he had been repeatedly called by General Ashley that he raised himself from the posture he had, Indian-like, assumed, and looked around him. He then saw, in himself, the sole occupant of the bar. The Indians rushing from the village to take the scalps of those killed. He plunged into the stream and swam for the boats, amid the pattering of a shower of balls on the water around him. He reached one of them, rifle in hand, in safety, and was the last man to do so. Three weeks later, after the fur trappers led by William Ashley and Joseph Pilcher rode to Colonel Henry Leavenworth, he met them near the Arikara village. After a brief first skirmish, there were roughly 3,000 Arikaras in the village, with over 800 warriors beyond strong fortifications. On the 10th of August, Colonel Leavenworth ordered an artillery bombardment, but it was ineffective, and he decided to make peace. He did not want to risk the lives of his men with a great battle, so the leaders held a discussion. They decided they needed to have someone to go to the village and ask for a peace council. Therefore, there was only one man to go: Edward Rose. Felton H.W. states, quote, "A man whose judgment, courage, and knowledge of Indians and their language could be trusted." And Rose accomplished his mission well. 11 Arikara chiefs came out of their village and signed a peace treaty with 6 of the army officers. This had upset the trappers, who had lost 12 to 14 men, but the treaty was signed, and that was that. After the grueling battle with the Arikara tribe, General William Henry Ashley wasted no time in sending his men westward to carry out their original plan, to trap as many beavers as possible in the untamed wilderness. 1 month later, Ashley led a smaller party of men to depart from Fort Kiowa, and once again, Edward Rose was selected to be part of this expedition. However, the journey quickly turned treacherous, as the group found themselves in a desperate situation with no access to food or water, struggling to endure the punishing heat. It was then that Ed Rose was chosen to brave the elements and seek help, believing he could make the arduous trek to the Crow tribe. Sadly, the horses were too worn down from the rigorous travel to carry him, forcing Rose to continue on foot. As he turned and set off, Felton H.W.'s words perfectly capture the moment. Quote, "At the first rise of land, Rose paused and lifted a hand in farewell. Then he turned and broke into the Indian jog that might, just might, take a strong man to the Crows." With October now upon them, the group was forced to contend with the dramatic shift from the scorching heat to freezing temperatures and biting winds, their horses faltering more and more with each passing day. The men could only wonder if Ed Rose would ever return to them, or if he had fallen victim to a grizzly bear or hostile native warriors eager to claim the scalp of 5 scalps. Suddenly, dull eyes were lit up with hope, but also fear. A line of horsemen approached. Was it friend or foe? Could it possibly be Ed Rose? As the distance closed, they could see that the man in the lead was a muscular man. The color of his skin was darker than those of the Indians. It was Edward Rose. He revived the group with food and water. To the exhausted trappers, he was seen as a rescuing angel. He and the Crow Indians that accompanied him gave them the necessary materials for them to continue their journey and their trapping. Jedediah Smith then gave Rose the valuable goods to take with him back to Crow country for safekeeping. The expedition had been saved. In 1825, General Henry Atkinson and Major Benjamin O'Fallon were commissioned to journey to the Yellowstone country and make treaties with the Indian tribes in the upper Missouri Valley. The expedition was well directed, but they needed more soldiers, weapons, horses, boats, and money. They also needed interpreters and guides, for without them, they could not communicate effectively. Ed Rose was one of the best at this particular job. On the 16th of May, 1825, 476 troops of the group left Fort Atkinson. 40 men on horseback under the command of Lieutenant Armstrong went with Rose by land. The rest of the men and supplies moved up the river on 9 boats, named Elk, White Bear, Buffalo, Raccoon, Beaver, Mink, Otter, Muskrat, and the 9th boat, which carried supplies for more personal needs, was named Lafayette. As the land group traveled, they struggled to find game. Sometimes, even the best hunters had trouble finding game on the prairie. They arrived at a Ponca village on May 25th, and Ed Rose left to ride back to the boat to do two things: tell General Atkinson that they had reached the Ponca tribe, and to get food. On Sunday, the 4th of June, Rose arrived, told Atkinson what he needed, and got a supply of pork from the boat's stores. The land party was busy. Ed Rose, Captain Armstrong, and Lieutenant Waters, along with the other soldiers and interpreters, would go from village to village and escort the Indians to the council for treaty talks in the upper Missouri Valley. On the 18th of June, Rose had led Lieutenant Waters' party of soldiers to a Cheyenne village. Upon their journey to the meeting place, he came upon a small knob and stopped. Those who followed came to his side and stood in a long line on the knob. They spotted some brown spots moving on the hillside across the valley. Only Ed Rose and the Cheyennes recognized what they were. The soldiers did not have an eye for it. There were 11 buffalo, and Ed Rose told the lieutenant that he would be back. Rose turned toward the Indians and made a few gestures. There was soon an excited murmur among the Cheyennes. 5 Scalps was going to the buffalo, alone, and it was going to be a good show. Ed Rose checked the direction of the wind. Buffalo did not have great eyesight, but they did have a great sense of smell. One small whiff of the hunter would send the herd scattering. Rose then pressed his knees against his mount, and in a short time was down in the gully on his stock. He dismounted and prepared for his stalk. He broke off some branches and put them through his belt, his headband and the straps holding his powder horn. To those watching on the nearby knob, it seemed as if a bush was moving toward the herd, slowly. As he was getting closer, the audience wondered, when would he fire? If he gets too close, he'll spook the herd, and then they won't get dinner. Suddenly, the bush stopped. One bull buffalo dropped. Ed Rose quickly reloaded and dropped another bull buffalo. The herd became nervous, but after raising their heads to see what had made the loud sound, saw and smelt nothing and returned to grazing. A third down, then a fourth, a fifth. The herd did not know what was wrong. They could not see or smell the danger, but they knew something was wrong. They broke into a gallop looking into the forest, but seeing nothing. Ed Rose raised his rifle one more time and fired. The 6th and final bull dropped dead. A clerk who kept the journal of Atkinson O'Fallon Yellowstone expedition made the following entries. Quote, Thursday, 30th of June. Rose, an interpreter, one of the party, we understand, covered himself with bushes and crawled into the gain of 11 bulls, and shot down 6 on the same ground before the others ran off. Then again, quote, Friday, 1st July. Today, the 6 buffalo killed by Rose yesterday were brought into camp and weighed net 3,300. The flesh was issued to the troops, making an issue of 4.5 days and 1.5 pounds of rations. Besides, the officers' messes were furnished with an abundance. With the American leaders needing to communicate and negotiate with the numerous native tribes gathered for the crucial council, having a skilled and knowledgeable interpreter was an absolute essential. While there were many interpreters available to General Atkinson, Major O'Fallon, and the other officers, Ed Rose stood out as the most invaluable of them all. Rose possessed a deep understanding of native culture, traditions, languages, and customs that allowed him to serve as an indispensable bridge between the representatives of the United States government and the indigenous leaders. As described by Felton H.W., quote, he sat at the right hand of the commissioners and the Army officers, and by his skill and knowledge, made sure the minds of the representatives of the United States and the Indians met and found common understanding. On the morning of July 7th, the American expedition moved up the river, covering a 1.5 mile stretch in full view of over 3,000 Native Americans lining the shoreline. While Captain Armstrong's men marched on foot, accompanied by 13 horses carrying provisions, Ed Rose was among the flankers on land, tasked with protecting the vulnerable boats. As the first to potentially encounter any hostile forces, Rose's presence was crucial, drawing upon his intimate knowledge of the tribes and ability to communicate with them to ensure the safe passage of the expedition. Then, on August 1st, 1825, Ed Rose would once again demonstrate his courage, fearlessness, and commanding personality in service of the American mission, underscoring his vital role in the delicate negotiations and sensitive diplomacy between the United States government and the indigenous nations. The Crows had been a part of the council meeting, signed a treaty, and the peace between the United States and the Crow tribe seemed assured. But this was not the case. The Crows had 2 Iroquois prisoners that they refused to let go, even at the request of the commissioners. While the argument took place, some Crow warriors snuck off and filled the military's cannon with dirt, which prevented it from being fired. They soon began demanding gifts and presents, even attempting to take the gifts before they were even offered. Major O'Fallon came rushing in to try and break up the disturbance. He drew his pistol and struck a Crow chief with it. This caused the 600 Crow warriors, who were fully armed, to start swirling around, their excited voices expressing their rage. Felton H.W. writes, quote, "Violence was beating within each Crow breast. They were ready for a fight. The peace treaty and the pleasant words of the council were forgotten. A fight would result in loss of life that would not be forgotten for many years. The whole expedition was on the brink of failure. The tension marked by the rising crescendo of angry voices was ready to break. It seemed that nothing could stop it." Suddenly, Ed Rose came in and seized a rifle from a pile laying at the feet of the chiefs. He began swinging the barrel, and many warriors felt its sting. Soon, the crowd backed away, making a wide circle with 5 scalps at the center. He was face to face with Longhair, who was one of the principal chiefs. He raised his gun, ready to make Longhair his next victim. Lieutenant Holmes writes in his book, The 5 Scalps, quote, "One foot was on the pile of muskets, to prevent the Indians from taking any from it, and the other was on the ground. Though to all appearance, he would have died with 100 wounds, had the storm burst. Still, his eye gleamed with triumphant satisfaction. There was an expression about his mouth, slightly curved and compressed, and a little smiling at the curves, indicative of a delirium of delight. His eye, his mouth, the position of his head, and scars on his forehead and nose, all united in forming a general expression that, of itself, seemed to paralyze the nerves of every Indian before him. Once seen, the mind forever retains it. I have often, and often, dreamed of the look and positions of that man in that council scene. It has arisen before me when alone in my room, and when surrounded by a crowd. It distinctly exhibited a compound of every passion and feeling in the human heart, except mercy." The 5 Scalps showed mercy. Whether intelligence or knowledge of Native American ways, the shouting began to die out, and silence began to settle among the enraged warriors. 600 Crow warriors, silenced by one man. The Atkinson O'Fallon expedition of 1825 turned out successful. The commissioners achieved their goal. They had successfully found all the tribes they hoped, except for 2. They made satisfactory treaties, and they believed that they had left the natives with a strong impression of power but also friendship of the United States. The guides and interpreters of the expedition had carried an enormous responsibility, with success or failure riding on their shoulders. Ed Rose was one of the most important men, and as Felton H.W. puts it, quote, "Edward Rose is entitled to a firm and high place among the heroes who took the first steps in the taming of an unknown wilderness." Historians are unsure exactly what Ed Rose was up to after the Atkinson O'Fallon expedition, but the next time we hear from him, he was living back with the Crow. Shocker, I know. We know this because a man by the name of Zenas Leonard writes about meeting Ed Rose in 1832. He talks about meeting a black man for the first time when Ed Rose appeared with 5 hunting horses that he had stolen. The theft had taken place in November on the headwaters of the Colorado River, according to Felton H.W. Zenas Leonard talks about in his book, Narrative of the Adventures of Zenas Leonard, saying, quote, that the man was a trader on the Missouri River and remained ever since he returned west, with, quote, Mr. McKinney, possibly referring to Donald Mackenzie, who was a partner in the Wilson Price Hunt expedition. He then states, quote, he has acquired a correct knowledge of their manner of living and speaks their language fluently. He has rose to be quite a considerable character, or chief, in their village. At least he assumes all the dignities of a chief. for he has 4 wives, with whom he lives alternately. This is the custom of many of the chiefs. Here's where it gets confusing. There was another black man that came west of the Lewis and Clark expedition. His name was York. He was a slave of William Clark, and some people believe that this is who Mr. Leonard was talking about. But this is proven to be untrue. William Clark himself provided an account for York following the expedition, in which he talked about setting York free, setting him up as a wagon driver, and of York's last days, saying that he died in Tennessee from cholera. Another black fur trapper that was also a chief of the Crows was a man named James Beckwourth, who I'll definitely cover in the future, but he could also be a candidate for the man that Mr. Leonard was talking about. The issue with this belief is that he was born in 1798. He would have been around 5 or 6 years old when the Lewis and Clark expedition departed. Although James Beckwourth was known to stretch the truth, and by stretch, I mean stretch the truth. That being said, James Beckwourth was a trailblazer of his own, and did many amazing things as a fur trapper, explorer, warrior, and translator. But it does seem most likely that Mr. Leonard was speaking of Edward Rose. But to be completely transparent, I am no expert whatsoever. I'm just a man with a passion for learning about Western history, a computer, and a cheap microphone. So please take my opinion on this matter with a grain of salt. But even historians can't fully agree on who it was. Regardless, here is what we do know. Mr. Leonard writes in his book about an event that he took part in that happened on the 20th of November, 1834, somewhere close to the Bighorn and Wind Rivers. 500 crows started out for a buffalo hunt. Most were hunters, but a few warriors were among them. Mr. Leonard and his companions followed them as, quote, "This was a favorable opportunity for me to gratify my curiosity in seeing this kind of sport." But the Crow warriors soon caught sight of their most hated enemy, the Blackfeet. The Crows were no longer thinking of the buffalo hunt, but of war. When the Blackfeet realized that they were being attacked, they climbed a rocky hillside where they found a ledge of rocks a few feet high in the shape of a horseshoe, the perfect fighting position. News spread of the Blackfeet being near, and 200 Crow warriors came to the scene mounted for an attack. But the fire from the makeshift fort was too strong, and it forced them to retreat. After failing multiple times to overtake the Blackfeet, some of the Crow warriors were ready to retreat and call it quits. But Edward Rose, who was with Mr. Leonard and his party, spoke to the Crow warriors, stating, quote, "He told them that they had been here making a great noise, as if they could kill the enemy by it. He told them their hearts were small, and that they were cowardly, that they acted more like squaws than men, and were not fit to defend their hunting ground." Mr. Leonard then goes on to write of Ed Rose getting the warriors even more fired up, and led them on a great assault of the fort, and victory had come in just moments. But unfortunately, there are some inaccuracies with his accounts. The first, that this sounds awfully familiar to the 5 Scalps story, which is much more verified by multiple accounts. The second being, if you listen to our latest deep dive series on the mountain man Hugh Glass, you may have caught the fact that we were talking about 1834. But we know that Hugh Glass and Ed Rose were ambushed by Arikaras in 1833 and were both killed. In short, according to HughGlass.org, quote, "In the early spring of 1833, Glass, accompanied by Edward Rose and Helene Menard, departed Fort Cass to trap beaver a short way downriver from the fort. As the trappers were crossing the ice of the frozen river, they were ambushed by a large party of Arikara Indians, who had been concealed on the opposite bank. All 3 men were shot, scalped, and plundered. It was these men's misfortune that an Arikara war party, bent on stealing horses, had been scouting the area around the fort when they spotted the trappers." Edward Rose was one of the many men that went west in search of riches, exploration, freedom, among many other reasons. Each man had their own story and their own whys. But without men like Ed Rose, the ones who were able to help bring peace between the United States and the native tribes, though notwithstanding, it makes you wonder what the West would look like today. Thank you everyone for listening. I hope y'all enjoyed it. If you do, please leave a rating and review. It is an awesome way for this podcast to grow, and I appreciate it greatly. Please email me with comments, questions, concerns, and I will try my best to get back to you. You can email me at wildwestdeepdives@gmail.com. We'll see y'all next week. When in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.